Presented by Caltech.
Welcome to our first Harris lecture of this year. My name is Diana Buchwald. I'm a historian of science in the Division of the Humanities and Social Sciences here at Caltech. And it gives me a great pleasure to welcome you to another one of our William and Myrtle Harris Distinguished Lectures in Science and Civilization. The Harris Lecture Series began in 1996 with a generous contribution by Bill and Myrtle Harris. Bill received his Bachelor of Science degree in Mechanical Engineering in 1949 at Caltech, a master's degree in Mechanical Engineering 1 year later. He is a very active member of the Caltech Associates and a member of the Caltech President Circle, and I'm sorry he couldn't be with us here today, but he sends regards. In addition to supporting the Harris Lecture Series and the Science, Ethics, and Public Policy program at Caltech, the Harris family has contributed to the summer undergraduate research fellowship programs and to the Associates Endowed Undergraduate Scholarship. The Harris Lectureship enables our program in the history and philosophy of science to bring to campus distinguished scientists, historians, philosophers, and other analysts of science, such as today's distinguished speaker, who is a policy analyst for education, science, the humanities, and the social sciences. Dr. Liviu Matei is Provost and Pro-Rector of the Central European University in Budapest, Hungary, where he has lived for a decade and a half. The Central European University is a relatively new university, as you will hear. It is devoted to the graduate education of humanists and social scientists. Dr. Matei benefited from various fellowships at the Institut Supérieur de Formation Sociale et de Communication in Bruxelles, the New School for Social Research, Université Paris X Nanterre, Université de Savoie, and the Salzburg Seminar. He taught at many universities in Europe and the United States. He has consulted for UNESCO, for the Council of Europe, and many other important bodies that, as you will hear, regulate, propose, discuss higher education much more than is the case in the United States. Before joining CEU, he worked as a Director General for International Relations at the Romanian Ministry of Education. He served as co-chair of the Working Group of Higher Education and Stability Pact for Southeast Europe, and on various other committees. He studied philosophy and psychology at Babes-Bolyai University in Cluj and sociology at Bucharest University, from which he also received his PhD. So it gives me great pleasure to pass the microphone to Dr. Matei.
Well,
Thanks
you
for
very
coming
much,
all this way.
Thank you. It's great being here. Good afternoon, everyone. Because I am coming from far away, not only geographically, but also I believe in terms of area of interest, perhaps I should just add a few words about my background, adding to the generous introduction by Diana. So my field is higher education policy. I am a higher education policy person, and I consider myself a very lucky person because I had the chance to experience almost all facets of higher education and higher education policy. I teach higher education policy at Central European University. I had the chance to work in many applied policy projects in Europe and outside Europe. I'm doing administration as well as provost. I worked at the Ministry of Education before, so I had a chance to know about higher education policy from a variety of perspectives. Some of the most interesting projects I had the chance to work in, I'll mention perhaps two or three. A few years ago, there was a project about university autonomy in Europe, which was supposed to result in a method to measure university autonomy in Europe, but instead what we did was to provide a kind of definition of university autonomy in a European context, and that project ended with 2 reports, which are the main reference now in Europe for the discussion about university autonomy. And then perhaps because of that, I have been invited together with a couple of colleagues to advise the government of Burma, Myanmar, of all places. You know, well, I'm sure the history, so Myanmar is opening up after decades of dictatorship. Universities are not only controlled but repressed. They are going to physical extermination of students, and all of a sudden the government, the formal generals, decided that the university sector is something of interest. So for the last 2-3 years, 2.5 years, we have been advising the government and also universities on university autonomy, which is, sometimes people are asking, who do you think you are? The small university in Budapest with 200 professors and 1,500 students to advise the government of a country with 60 million people. So that's actually a quite good question. And now we are working on a project in Cuba, trying for an international organization to figure out where Cuban higher education might go from where it is at present, which is also quite interesting. So my interest, this is in a way to say that my interest is in applied higher education policy, but we are very lucky also at my university when we teach higher education policy or policy in general. We don't do it as a narrow professional endeavor, but we try to inform our research and our teaching with perspectives coming from social sciences, humanities, and students in public policy study history, for example, or they study philosophy, or in particular courses we are supposed to bring various perspectives. So I'm going to talk about something which fits in this area of interest. I'm not sure anybody in the room has any particular interest in that area, but what I will try to do is talk about something that is very down to earth in a certain way, but also trying to go into more abstract, I shouldn't say esoteric territories, but pretty abstract. So I'm going to talk about knowledge society as a practical utopia and how it influences, sometimes in a hidden way, higher education and higher education policies. Now, I would propose that when we talk about the knowledge society, or when we read about the knowledge society, there are basically 2 perspectives. One perspective is to talk about the knowledge society as a historical phenomenon or as a new type of society, and I'll say a few more words about that. And there's a lot of literature, research, publications about this. But one could also talk about the knowledge society as a policy narrative, as a kind of story that politicians, policymakers keep repeating almost as a refrain everywhere in the world. And this policy narrative does have a very serious influence on higher education policies. I would even say it is probably the dominant policy narrative of our times in higher education. So I will talk a little bit about that. And I believe it is important to talk about the knowledge society as a policy narrative as well, because this is relevant from a scholarly perspective. The impact of the knowledge society as a policy narrative is not really studied. Then, there is also a policy perspective. Knowledge society influences a lot of policies, actual policies, good policies, bad policies, and sometimes even very bad policies. And we talk very little about that. The knowledge society narrative is accepted usually without any kind of critical approach. So people are asking, when I give a talk like this, what's wrong with the knowledge society? Why do we have to look into something that doesn't work eventually or is not good about this perspective? And then I would say there's a practical perspective as well, because this policy narrative does influence what universities do, the work of universities in many, perhaps most parts of the world, and this is true about faculty, students, and administrators. And I would further suggest that in order to understand how this works, how come that knowledge society as a policy narrative influences higher education policies and higher education practice, one important element is the concept of knowledge society project. So I will propose that this is a very important concept in order to understand how the knowledge society as a policy narrative works. And I'll come back to this, but just to anticipate a little bit, there is a certain belief, at least in the policy sphere, that the knowledge society is not only something that develops historically, but it's something that can be built. It can be built programmatically, taking a managerial perspective. And when I mean managerial, one can go back all the way to the etymology of the word management, which comes from manu agere, Latin manu agere, which means to lead by the hand. So one could put in place knowledge society projects at local level, in a community, in a country, in a region, and even at planetary scale. You may say, what is that? How could anyone believe that you can have a project and implement it in a real managerial perspective at the scale of the entire planet? And I will try to show that I'm not making it up. Such projects do exist, and actually this is the only reason why I'm using PowerPoint, because I will show some codes from various documents so that you can believe me, I'm not making it up. It is actually real. Furthermore, I would suggest that it is possible to provide a taxonomy of knowledge society projects, because there are thousands of knowledge society projects in the world. There is a jungle of knowledge society projects, but I believe it is possible to organize them, and this taxonomy helps to understand their influence on higher education policies and practice. Then furthermore, I will say the knowledge society, again, as a policy narrative, is an utopian narrative, but at the same time, it is something with practical consequences. So this is to a large extent an utopian construction, but not without practical consequences, and this is why I am calling it a practical utopia. And I'm not going to go into the literature about utopia and utopias, but just illustrate what is this all about, and how this sometimes very utopian projections do have a practical influence, an actual influence on higher education. So going back to where I started, perspectives on the knowledge society, I said one perspective is the knowledge society as a historical phenomenon or as a type of society. This has been studied by sociologists, economists, anthropologists, and these are just a few names. I'm sure you are familiar with all or perhaps most of them. Peter Drucker, Daniel Bell, Manuel Castells, Amartya Sen, who was one of the, how should I say, the individuals who made the most for making the knowledge society a global policy narrative. Or Joseph Stiglitz just published a book not a long time ago about creating a learning society, which is also about the knowledge society. So this is, I'm not going to talk about this perspective on the knowledge society, but about the second one, about knowledge society as a policy narrative, and this is something where there is a lot less research, almost no research at all. It is very difficult to mention more than 2 or 3 names, and these are researchers that very few people probably know about. Now, just a few words to know where we are starting. When we talk about the knowledge society as a new type of society, this is sometimes presented as the same with the post-industrial society, and the core considerations there are that knowledge nowadays is the main factor of production, as opposed to earlier times when labor or capital or natural resources were the main factors of production. So here, scholars, researchers talk about knowledge economy, first of all. But then many scholars say it is actually more than that. Knowledge influences all key aspects of the social life nowadays, including employment, but also group relations, or going to geopolitics, for example. Or from another perspective, knowledge actually creates new possibilities to improve the human condition altogether. So it's altogether a new type of society, and we can understand this starting from the analysis of knowledge and the role of knowledge. Now, this literature is a lot more sophisticated, obviously, than I am summarizing here, because sometimes it is not clear whether such scholars are talking about the knowledge society as a reality or as a possibility. Is it something that is already here, or is something that might come? You know, in the way Marx said that communist society is inevitable; it will come. So some scholars say the knowledge society is something that will come; is not necessarily here. But some other times there is talk about the knowledge society as a political objective. This is something we should build. We should try to construct rather than something that is already here. Now, what about the knowledge society as a policy narrative? So there are a few sentences or a few statements that can summarize this narrative. And if we turn on the radio or the TV or we read the newspapers, we can hear elements of this almost every day. So this narrative includes statements like the following. We live in a knowledge society in which globalization, in an increasingly information and communication technology mediated environment, affects all countries and regions of the world and brings about unprecedented challenges, but also unprecedented opportunities, which are fundamentally the same in all parts of the world. So what are these challenges? And again, this is something that is almost part of the daily talk. One important challenge is to cope with and survive global competition. Knowledge society is characterized as being about competition among individuals, companies, countries, blocks of countries, and the competition is played based on knowledge, saturated products, you name it. But there is another challenge which has to do with the need to cope with unprecedented and ever-accelerating rhythm of change. The knowledge society allegedly would make the technological, economic, and social change a lot more rapid than it has ever been. So there is this set of challenges. But then where it becomes even more interesting is about opportunities. So as part of this narrative, we can hear very often that, and I will show you some illustrations, that the knowledge society brings about unprecedented opportunities for development and growth, and through this for a kind of ultimate liberation or liberating renaissance as a possibility. And just to illustrate, this is a quote from a UNDP document. UNDP is the United Nations Development Program, which says that if right policies for the knowledge society are applied, this would lead to freeing people from deprivation in all its form and expand their choices. So you can see a little bit of a utopian element here already. So knowledge society would make it possible to free people from deprivation in all its forms, and sometimes it is said forever, once and forever. Now, this knowledge society narrative is very often manifested in knowledge society projects. So by projects, I mean attempts to put in practice certain objectives or actual endeavors which are oriented by very clear objectives with very clear mechanisms of trying to achieve them. Knowledge society projects are based on the belief that it is possible to take advantage of opportunities, and also that there is perhaps an obligation to face the challenges. So now, studying this discourse on the knowledge society, one could very often come across statements like, unless we do something to address these challenges, there will be very bad consequences, going all the way to the end of the world, for example. So there is a possibility to take advantage of opportunities and an obligation to try to address challenges, and this could be done through action that is rooted in well thought through and articulated policy programs which are specifically designed for this project. So these are projects that are meant to address knowledge society challenges or take advantage of knowledge society opportunities. And this should be done in a managerial perspective, like a conscious project with clear planning, organization, direction, and controlling. So this is again this idea that it could be led by the hand almost. So in a way, and again, this could be a very long discussion, the knowledge society policy discourse is not even about knowledge, but it is about what can be done in this knowledge society and what can be done in a managerial perspective. Peter Drucker famously wrote, I think it was 94, 95, that the main organ of the knowledge society is management. So knowledge society is not about knowledge, it is about jobs, it is about economy, it is about management. Now, I mentioned that there are many knowledge society projects in the world, and I tried at some point to propose a taxonomy. I believe knowledge society projects can be simply organized along two dimensions. One is the geographic scope, and the other one is the sectorial or sectoral scope, and I'll try to illustrate. So sometimes there are local projects in a small neighborhood, in a village, or in a local community. Some other times there are national projects or regional projects, including several countries or several parts of several countries. There are international projects which are not limited to a defined geographic region, and even global projects that try to cover the entire humanity. And then, depending on their geographic, on their sectorial scope, we can talk of monosectoral projects which focus on one aspect. It could be, for example, civil society or commerce or e-governance, and I'll give some examples in a moment, or plurisectorial, trying to combine several of these sectors, or perhaps all-inclusive. So there are knowledge society projects which try to solve everything in a given community, country, or region, or eventually for the planet as a whole. So what do I mean? And just to illustrate, and then I'll say a few more words about the red entries there. So there are projects about. So let's take the Bologna project. This is a project which I call monosectorial because it is only about higher education, but it includes all countries of Europe now, 47 countries. One actually is not a member, Belarus. And it is a knowledge society project, and I will explain in a moment why it is a knowledge society project. Or sometimes there is an all-inclusive knowledge society project in a part of Finland, which the local authorities believe that it is possible to design a plan that will address poverty, social exclusion, democratic participation, and so on by developing certain elements of the knowledge society. Or Finland had a national strategy for the knowledge society, a very complex strategy for the knowledge society. Or to give another example, and I will come back to this Lisbon strategy of the European Union. So I consider this a regional, all-inclusive knowledge society project. So what is this about? In March 2000, the heads of states and governments of the European Union met in Lisbon, therefore the name, and they adopted a new strategy for the European Union for a period of 10 years, so from 2000 to 2010, which posed very clear objectives. By 2010, the European Union will become the most competitive economy of the world. By 2010, the European Union will have zero unemployment, full employment. Moreover, so how are we going to do all this? By building a knowledge society which will result in a model of society that is the most adapted to the needs of women and men of Europe. And I'm not making it up. And this developed into an actual program with budgets, with institutions that were created to support it, with task force, with biannual evaluation. A huge institutional machinery was put in place in order to fulfill the objectives of this strategy. Now, we are in 2015. The European Union is not the most competitive economy of the world. It is the unemployment is, I think on average 15%, between 15 and 20% in Europe. Whether this is the most adapted society to the needs of women and men, this is something that can be discussed. But this was real, and this is an example trying basically to address all that is considered important in a society, in this case a group of states, through knowledge society means. But there are other projects like that, and we don't talk about that much. One is the Arab Renaissance project. So this is very interesting because it was commissioned by UNDP at all, and it resulted, among others, in a series of reports, Arab Human Development Reports, which were written by Arab civil society activists, scholars, not politicians. And they said basically the Arab countries experience several major deficits. There's a deficit of democracy in the Arab countries. There's a deficit of knowledge, starting with rates of literacy and women participation. So what was the proposal? How should the Arab countries overcome this situation? By building a knowledge society. And one of these reports is specifically a set of prescriptions. It's a 200+ reports. How should the Arab countries build a knowledge society in order to address all their major problems? I exaggerate a little bit, not too much when I say all. It is not exactly all, but what was identified as the most important problems there. There's another very interesting project of the African Renaissance, which was launched by the former president of South Africa, Thabo Mbeki, who also served as vice president under President Mandela. And this started as a kind of cultural project. It would be good, important, perhaps necessary for African countries to rediscover their cultural roots, their values from before the colonial times. So that's why it is called Renaissance. But then it became a knowledge society project because now it was formulated in terms of how could African countries become competitive while building on their traditional roots by building a knowledge society. The Arab Renaissance project didn't result in much actual work. Perhaps it contributed to the Arab Spring. That is something that can be discussed. There was a lot more work along the lines of this African Renaissance project. And then, now, just a couple of other projects. UN Millennium Development Project, which you may know about. So this was started in 2000 following the largest meeting ever of all heads of states and government. 190 of them met and adopted the Millennium Declaration, which outlined also a project until 2015, which was fundamentally about eradicating poverty, how to eradicate poverty. And then, because it is a project, it wasn't defined as a project, I define it as a project, it had 8 objectives, 19 indicators, 16 task forces, deadlines, and everything you want. There was no talk about higher education. This was not about higher education. Lisbon was not about higher education. The others, Bologna was about higher education, but the others were not. So we'll have to discuss where does higher education comes into the picture. You may also ask, this Millennium Development Project, has anything been achieved? Quite a lot has been achieved. Not exactly what was planned originally, but there is discussion now about relaunching the project in this year. And some advocate to include objectives about higher education very specifically, because at present objectives are about literacy. We should increase the rate of literacy to this, participation of girls, poverty. The number of people living on less than $1 a day should be halved by 2015. So these are the kinds of objectives that define the Millennium Development Project. But this was an UN project. Another very interesting project was the World Summit on the Information Society, which was a joint venture between the UN Communications Agency and business organizations, Cisco, Microsoft, and the idea there was to build a global information society, to bridge the digital divide. And again, this is not something we hear about every day, but it's still at work out there, and I'll give a few more examples based on this in a moment. So this gives you a little bit of a picture of what knowledge society projects are, or I believe they are. Now, where is higher education in all this? I think a common pattern around the world is that higher education will sooner or later come into the picture. Now, although such projects usually don't start with higher education, most often there is not one single mention about higher education at the beginning. Sooner or later, they will start telling universities what to do. So it gets to exactly that point in order to achieve the objectives of the project. So some examples. Bologna project process is a project about higher education. So I'm not going to talk about it now. But let's take the Lisbon strategy. So Lisbon, as I said, started in 2000 with these objectives. Until 2003, there was no talk about higher education and universities. And then in 2003, the European Commission issued a communication which is kind of, I don't know, like a gospel from the European Commission that everybody is supposed to read, comment, and it's something that informs further policies. The title of that communication was The Role of Universities in Building the Europe of Knowledge. And it says briefly something like this: we have this ambitious project in Europe, but it will not be achieved. We will not be the most competitive. We will not have full employment. Why? Because universities in Europe are no good. So the sky is falling upon us, and it is the fault of universities. And in order to achieve these objectives, we need to reform European universities. And we are going to tell governments and universities how to reform. And this is very interesting because at that time, the European Union didn't have any constitutional mandate to act on higher education. So according to the treaties of the European Union, that's why I'm talking about constitutional mandate, this was supposed to be the exclusive prerogative of national governments, higher education policy. So the European Commission said, we don't have a higher education policy, we are not going to have one, but what they did nevertheless was to put in place a very powerful higher education policy with huge influence on the work of universities in the European Union and actually even beyond the European Union. And again, I'll give some examples about it. The Millennium Development Project was not about higher education, but then it came quite quickly into the picture. So the Millennium Development Project is about access to health, for example. Well, in order to ensure access to health, one needs doctors and nurses. So where are they trained? In universities. You know, in order to reduce the rate of illiteracy, one needs professors and teachers. So where are they trained? And very soon, higher education came into the picture. And what is interesting here, who is the main agent calling for universities to play a role? The World Bank. So the World Bank made the Knowledge Society its main mandate in the last 10 years. And it started to act as a model setter for universities, telling universities from Chile to Vietnam and from Poland to South Africa what to do under the power of the Knowledge Society narrative and linked very directly to the objectives of the Millennium Development Project. So this is very interesting. You know, how could a bank, World Bank is a bank. It is about giving loans, grants for development. It is true, but how come such an organization can play a role when it comes to higher education? And it does play still today, despite of some what some people say, it does play a very, very important role. So these are, I can cite examples from Korea, from India, from Australia, from Brazil. I won't do it for United States because, except very little at the end, because I'm not exactly familiar with the situation here. I think the only country where I couldn't talk about Knowledge Society projects is Iran, but I'm not sure, as a matter of fact, because I haven't done any study there. So these are just examples, and there was, as I said, actual work in Africa. They created the Pan-African University Network, which was supposed to participate to this African Renaissance project. Or, very interestingly, in the context of the Arab Human Development project and report, there was talk about building a very particular Arab Knowledge Society model, which is similar but also different from the Western model, and universities were supposed to have the primary role in creating such a model. Very little has been done, actually, so this was more of a vision than an actual project. So what is the impact on higher education? Very rapidly. So as soon as the higher education comes into the picture, there will be some kind of a call that higher education must contribute to the project, That is the mission of universities in the knowledge society, to contribute to the achievement of very specific objectives of very specific knowledge society project. It is not the pursuit of truth. It is, for example, achieving the objectives of the Lisbon strategy, or it is about achieving the objectives of the Millennium Development Project, or you name it. And in this way, you know, there is a further step which says that in order to do all this, you know, in knowledge society, universities need to change, to reform, and higher education policies need to change. We need universities for the knowledge society, and we need higher education policies for the knowledge society. So we need new models of higher education policy and new model of higher education institutions. So there was talk, for example, about the Lisbon University. So, you know, you'll find texts in which it is written that European universities should not cater to their national objectives, but to the European objectives, and they should be Lisbon universities, or they should be universities for the Renaissance model, or, as the World Bank would argue, they should be developmental universities. So there is a kind of generic attempt to assign mission, a new mission to universities, but the particular mission depends on the particular context and the particular project. And you know, what is happening is that decisions on models, and this is something you don't have, I believe, in America, decisions of models, what to teach, how to organize the institutions, how to organize at national level, are external to the higher education system. The World Bank is defining the model of developmental universities. The European Commission or the European Parliament decides. And I'll give you an example. We now have in Europe something we call European Qualification Framework for Higher Education, which is adopted by the European Parliament. The European Parliament is almost like a parliament, not exactly like a parliament. There are some 700 plus people working half a week in Brussels, the other half in Strasbourg. And they adopted this framework which defines what different degrees should be, what a PhD is in Europe, what a master is in Europe, what a bachelor is in Europe. So this is, and governments are supposed to translate these definitions into national qualification frameworks, and then universities are supposed to translate these guidelines into actual programs. So if I want to start a new program in my university, I have to show it is compatible with the European definition of a PhD or of a master or of a bachelor. And it's actually a little more complicated because national translation involves not only governments but what is called social partners, for example. So an important part of the decision of the work of universities is taken away from universities themselves, because these institutions believe this is how Europe will become more competitive. This is how we can cope with this challenge of competitiveness if we have a common framework. And we have now a common framework of degrees, degree structures in Europe. We have qualifications. We have common standards and guidelines for quality assurance. We have a European credit system which applies almost everywhere in Europe. Or, as I said, there are other examples from India. India had a knowledge commission, for example, which was appointed by the Prime Minister of India, which was supposed to come up with recommendations at national level, including higher education or Australia. So this is a little bit very rapidly trying to model the impact on higher education of the knowledge society narrative through knowledge society projects. Now, why do I say this is utopian? I think I offered some hints to that already. Knowledge society in this context, in this type of discourse, it is considered sometimes the solution to all problems, or at least the most important solution to the most important problems anywhere, despite diversity of local situations. And this is very interesting. So the European Union wants to build a knowledge society to be the most competitive in the world. Arab countries are talking about building a knowledge society in order to catch up or to increase the level of democratic participation. In Africa, knowledge society is a tool to achieve some kind of cultural revival. So the problems are different, but the solution is surprisingly the same, which makes me say this is an element of utopian, having one solution to these very different situations and problems. Sometimes it is said this is the only solution, and I can show you text where it is written, in this country you should build a knowledge society, or otherwise you will be left out, and you will be left out forever. It is knowledge society, and knowledge society now. Otherwise, it is really the end of the world. It is also utopian because it states that somewhat this will mean the end of history. Because if we do that in Europe, there will be nothing after that. If this is the society that is most adapted to the needs of women and men, it's like, when I talk about this to my students, they say, but isn't this the communist utopia? To some extent it is, but it's not exactly that. So it is, knowledge society would lead either to paradise or, if it is not there, to hell. I think it is also utopian because it assumes a very narrow, or proper, as it is called sometimes, managerial perspective. So it is possible to build knowledge society at national level, regional level, global level, like manufacturing a product almost, so in a strict managerial perspective. Now, you may believe I am making this up to some extent, so I wanted to show some codes from various documents in this context. This is where it all started, the African Renaissance project, with a statement by then Deputy President Thabo Mbeki, in which he says, the beginning of our rebirth as a continent must be our own discovery of our soul, captured and made permanently available in the great works of creativity represented by the pyramids and the sphinxes of Egypt, the stone building of Aksum, the ruins of Carthage and Zimbabwe, the rock paintings of San, the Benin bronzes, and the African mask, the carvings of the Makonde, and the sculpture of Shona. So this sounds all very, very cultural in a way, but it's more than that. And this is from a very comprehensive study of all this attempt, in which the author said this project is not only about rediscovering the historical roots of the continent and cultural values, but it is actually about ensuring that Africa can take place along the nations of the world as a knowledge society. So this is one example. I spoke already about Lisbon. I'm not going to repeat it. So look at this. Speaking of global projects and global, this is from a UNESCO handbook explaining the Millennium Development Project. United Nations Millennium Declaration. In this declaration, the nations of the world have outlined their preferred map for future institutional change, and all the emphasis are mine. It reads like a blueprint for world making. It talks about a more peaceful, prosperous, and just world. De facto, it speaks about many building blocks of the knowledge society and the home for the knowledge society. So it is possible to make the world. This is a project for world making. This is another code. The first one is perhaps too long. I just wanted to illustrate, talk about challenges and opportunities. But let me go to the shorter one, which is from an official document. We are committed to making the right to development a reality for everyone and to freeing the entire human race from want. It's very worthy objective. Is it achievable? That is a different question. This is also a very interesting quote from a document circulated in the context of the World Summit for the Information Society. It's before the second main meeting of this project. This event, in many respects, can be seen as a summit on global future, no less than that. This will be the first global attempt to come to grips with a potentially malleable and technologically determinable future. So you see again this managerial perspective. And I mentioned that the Bologna project is about higher education, but it's a knowledge society project. This is a quote from the Bologna Declaration of 1999, where it all started. A Europe of knowledge is now widely recognized as an irreplaceable factor for social and human growth, and indispensable component to consolidate and enrich the European citizenship, capable of giving its citizens the competences to face challenges of the new millennium, together with an awareness of shared values and belonging to a common social and cultural space. So it's a knowledge society project in a very specific economic, social, and political context. So there are elements of utopia in all this. As I mentioned, the European Union is not the most competitive. Millennium Development Project has not eradicated poverty on Earth, but still there is a lot of actual work and very often very good developments. And let me give you just a few examples, mainly from the European context. So one very interesting institution that has been created, so there was quite a lot that was done in Europe as part of the Lisbon project in the area of research. Because the understanding was, competitiveness is about knowledge, but it's not only about the use of knowledge, it's also about the production of knowledge, production of new knowledge. For that, we need research. And one institution that was created in this context is the European Research Council, which is the European counterpart of the National Science Foundation. Before that, European grants were given based on political considerations, country consideration. This institution gives grants only based on merit. And it has a huge budget, billions of euro, and it contributed to changing the dynamic of research and research policy in Europe. In my university, for example, we have 30% of our budget coming from the European Union, mainly from the European Research Council, 30%. So that makes a huge difference. We won't be able to do much research without that money. But because we are at an Institute of Technology, we also attempted to create a European Institute of Technology in Europe, which was supposed to bridge research with technological application. The model, I should say, was not Caltech, but MIT. But this turned to be a very difficult proposition in the European context because everybody wanted it. So everybody wanted to have the European Institute of Technology. It took years of European horse trading, and it became at some point a network institution, which means very little or nothing. In the end, it was decided that Budapest will have it, where I'm coming from. And now it's a very interesting organization, bringing together universities, research institutes, and the business sector. So it's not exactly the MIT model, but it starts to play a role in the European context. And this was a very specific achievement of this Lisbon agenda. We have in Europe something that is called the European Research Area, which was one of the first practical actions taken under the umbrella of the Lisbon strategy, again, with budgets, with the institutions, with policies. Or now, Lisbon was between 2000 and 2010. Since 2010, it was replaced with a new overarching strategy, which is called Europe 2020. As part of this strategy, we have something which is called Horizon 2020, which is a program supposed to support top-notch research in Europe. The budget is 70 billion euro between 2014 and 2020. And what is interesting, it was decided that research is so important that other pockets of the European Union should be made accessible to universities and research organizations. So there is another 400 billion that universities can access, compete for, together with research organizations. So that's not, it is utopian in some way, but it's quite material in some other ways. And there are other, I can mention a score of actual initiatives, perhaps very briefly, Erasmus Mundus. You probably know about Erasmus Mundus. At some point, some people in the European Commission thought that we can become more competitive if we cultivate not only our own brains, but we attract brains from other parts of the world. So Erasmus Mundus was created with this very specific objective. So universities from Europe at the beginning, only from Europe, were invited to form consortia, usually 4 universities, applying together to get money from the European Commission to bring students from outside the European Union, very lavishly paid. So universities were paid, professors were paid, students got very nice scholarships. They didn't have to pay any tuition. They have stipends, travel money, research money, and they had to study. These were master programs. They had to study at least 2 universities in Europe, which was another very attractive. So it was extremely successful. As you can imagine, all of a sudden, Europe started to attract students that it would have never attracted otherwise. And it was also good for the university. We had 3 such projects. and at least at the beginning, now the concept has changed, we made a profit on each of them, other than boosting our attractiveness. So we have one program in public policy. We had 1,000 applications for 30 places. 1,000 applications from 100 countries from 30 places. There would be no way to do that without this program. So it's again to say it is an utopia in some way, but it's a practical utopia. As I said, there was something, but a lot less in Africa, and that can be discussed, even a lot less in the Arab region, and then with the Arab, what was after the Arab Spring, it disappeared altogether. And I could also mention national endeavors. So I mentioned here Brain Korea, for example, which was a project adopted by the Korean government, trying to bet primarily on PhD education, increase the number of PhD graduates in Korea. And that is a kind of global syndrome. Under the influence of the knowledge society discourse, there's a kind of global war on PhD education. So countries talk about who has more PhD, who has less. You know, South Africa says we have only 5 per 1 million. Canada said, I don't remember exactly the numbers. And then there are national objectives. We have to increase the number of PhD students. So what the knowledge society policy narrative has done was, among other things, to increase the value, the political value of PhD, because that is supposed, again, to be where researchers are trained and where research is produced to some extent. So just to summarize, going back to the impact of the knowledge society policy narrative on higher education, it brings about very often new models of higher education. So in Europe now we have a common European space for higher education, which is real. You know, for all the discussions about how far it is from what was supposed to be, it is still real. Or there are transnational frameworks for higher education, not only in Europe, but in Southeast Asia. Now they are talking about building something similar to Bologna in Latin America or in Africa. There are new tools and instruments. I mentioned some of them just to give some examples, more recent examples. We have now in Europe starting a European pension scheme for researchers. So what is that? Now, pension arrangements are, for the time being, national in Europe, and they are very different. So if you move from one country to another, you may lose your pension. If you come from outside Europe, this is a big problem for us. If you come from the United States to Budapest, you have to pay 10% of your gross salary, whether you like it or not. But you cannot have any pension unless you paid 20 years. So if you pay only 19 years, you lose everything. So we have to put in place our own pension system, but it's very expensive. So now what the European Commission has done is to create a European pension scheme for researchers, which includes faculty members and university staff, administrative staff, because they believe this will stimulate mobility. This will creation of a kind of a larger academic and research area and market in Europe. We also have a European student loan scheme to stimulate mobility. Or I'll just give another example which is less positive, early stage researchers. So what is this mysterious term about? In Europe now we don't talk about PhD students anymore, almost. We are not allowed to. So we talk about early stage researchers, and this also comes from the European Parliament. It was adopted as a recommendation, not as a directive, not as a law, but very often funding is conditioned upon accepting this policy. So if I want to receive a PhD student with European money, I cannot call that person a PhD student. I have to call him or her early stage researcher, pay a salary, not give a stipend, with social security and everything that comes with a salary, because it was thought that this will convince good students to come to Europe, stay in Europe, rather than come here or go to other places, give them social security and also a kind of career prospect. Because we also have regulations about how to hire and promote researchers all the way, there are 4 steps, all the way from early stage researcher to star research. I think it's called established researchers. So that is very interesting, and it is what I call an exaggeration and an example about how knowledge society narrative can result in bad policies, because the notion of doctoral studies has changed. So it is now assumed that doctoral studies are not about learning. PhD students are not there to learn. but they are there to become researchers and to produce research. And as we know, not all of them will become researchers, as a matter of fact. Even in social sciences, humanities, in my university, we have more than 30% of our PhD students going into other professions than teaching in universities or doing research. But that was a very narrow definition of PhD studies, which must be about research, because research is what contributes to competitiveness. We go back to the narrative. And there are other examples at national levels. You might have heard of the excellence initiatives. Several governments in Europe, more than perhaps one might think. So there are 15, 16 European governments running excellence initiatives. And this is about giving additional funding, public funding, huge funding sometimes, to selected universities that are excellent in research. The other universities might be left to die, or they have to find solutions for themselves. So what I will also say, this impact is hidden, not studied. Even people who are actually involved, those who create new PhD programs, are not aware where all this comes from. It is also a kind of narrative that is interwoven with other policy narratives. So in Europe, knowledge society goes hand in hand with the European integration narrative. In other parts, it goes with the development discourse. And in the United States, it's very much mixed with the old vocationalist discourse, which says that education, including higher education, must be for vocations, for professions. Now, is this all good or bad? There are good policies, there are bad policies. I think it is very important to know about it, to understand how it works. And I will also say one of the most important contributions of this type of discourse is that it brings a lot of political and public support for universities. Politicians everywhere say, if we have to be competitive through research, where is research produced? Where are researchers being trained? So we need universities. Therefore, we need more and better educated people, higher enrollment, and governments have targets about enrollment. Funding, well, that is an issue, how to provide the funding. But what is also interesting, and I will end with this, talking a little bit about the future, what we experience in Europe is a kind of corrosion of the knowledge society narrative, which has an impact on higher education institutions. Some politicians and governments say, for example, we don't need more students, we need fewer students. The future of the country is not with highly educated people, but manual laborers. Now, this is one country that I would not name here, but this is again for real. We need to take away money from universities and put money where it matters, save the banks, or have the funds for social security. Or other politicians, the prime minister of my country of origin, one of the prime ministers said, forget all this talk about the knowledge society. We live in a capitalist society, and what makes capitalism work is not knowledge, but capital. We see during the financial crisis, if there is no equity, there is no development in the economy. So this is a very interesting, more recent development, and I believe the official discourse in the US is not like that. So the political discourse in the US is very much still, I shouldn't say still, it's very much along the lines of the knowledge society narrative. So we can discuss about very different paths actually in different parts of the world, but I would say this is a global policy narrative which almost always influences higher education policies, and I'll stop here.
I'll let those who want to leave. So I sometimes don't know whether to laugh or to cry while I was listening to you. It all has something Orwellian to it if it weren't so serious. And of course there are some good things that you pointed out to, so very good things happened. Recently I read of some of these initiatives with 70 billion, 400 billion offered by the European Commission. The Italians didn't even apply. What was it? There wasn't a single application to some of these programs. So could you comment on this managerial from the top national European policy has led to huge rearrangements of universities, the whole Bologna business, rearranging themselves on the Anglo-Saxon model. What has been the cost, in your view, of this, of these 15, 20 years of this narrative?
Right. Well, one thing I would say is that in the last 15, 20 years, so these were times of major changes in Europe, tectonic shifts actually. Now, from the concept of master didn't exist on continental Europe. That, as strange as it might sound. So this is a Bologna invention. We didn't have any credits. The concept of credits didn't exist. There was no student mobility. Now we have quite a significant student mobility. There was no faculty mobility. The curricula were completely different. So I can list probably some 15, 20 changes that are really major changes. But I would like to say a few words about one that I consider among the most important. So before the start of these projects, Bologna and Lisbon, which actually worked hand in hand when it comes to higher education, the main equation in higher education was between universities and the government, the national government, the state. Now, what Bologna has done was to scramble this, and now there are a lot more actors, and there's a transnational possibility as well. So if I don't get money from my government, I can go to the European Commission. If they don't want to accredit my program, I can make a case with the European Commission. If they don't allow students to come from Belgium to France, there will be a court case about this. So what has happened is that all of a sudden, or not all of a sudden, progressively, universities got a lot more freedom. So they are not exactly captive in the hands of national states as they were before. And the European Commission has programmatically pushed this. So they wanted to loosen the national control on universities. But what is interesting, this is more freedom for universities, for institutions, not for individuals, not for faculty. So in terms of, if we were to compare academic freedom, autonomy between the United States and Europe, the situation has not improved that much. But when it comes to institutions, quite a lot. So to answer your question, this is why I'm saying this, there are many possibilities. So universities can go and apply, can go and make a case. Some take advantage of these possibilities, some others don't. So the landscape is therefore very, very scattered. And now where this will go, I don't know. So everything was quite, in a way, predictable for the last 15 years. So there was some kind of, how do you call that, like a magnetic field, lines of force. Now the European integration narrative is fading away. The knowledge society narrative is corroding. It is not clear what will happen. So things have been reorganized, disorganized, and now all of a sudden many people are asking what next, and there's no clear answer to
that. This may be a somewhat naive question, but when people use the term knowledge society, does anyone know what it means?
Yeah.
What is it that people know? Or if we build a knowledge society, what is it that people are supposed to come to know?
There are many definitions. So there is, sometimes I present a slide with various terms. So we talk about knowledge economy, knowledge society, information society, learning society. Sometimes they are mixed together, knowledge economy and society. So the definitions change according to who is talking and what perspective they are talking. So I try to put a little bit of order here, distinguishing between those who are studying the knowledge society as a historical phenomenon and those who talk about making, building the knowledge society. But there is no consensus, there is no one. Sometimes there's no definition at all. So if one studies, which I have done, the European Union documents, there's not one single definition. What does it mean, knowledge society in that context? So there's very much talk about that, vague, confusing occasionally, and without clarity of concepts.
In the beginning of your lecture, you connected, or through the whole lecture, the role of the universities and knowledge society. And I think following your comments, I think definition of universities are quite different when you, for example, refer to Arab Spring
Right.
or Korea. It's fundamentally different than what we, at least in the West or US, call a university.
Mhm.
And academic freedom basically is not there. I mean, those universities are just factories to train people for the workforce or for the political objectives they have. So
Yeah.
I would like to hear your opinion
Right.
about this,
That-
how
that-
it really
That is also true. That's why I'm trying to use rather the term higher education more than universities. Perhaps I should say tertiary education, but I don't like that is even more confusing in a certain way. So you are right. When the European Commission issued this communication saying universities are bad, terrible in Europe, the European University Association issued an answer saying, you don't know what you are talking. You don't even know what a university is. Because in Europe, we don't have 4,000 universities, as you are saying, but only 1,000. Because university is a higher education institution awarding PhDs. No? Only that. So that was the definition. Now, in the United States, you have a certain system. In the Arab world, you are right. So there is this large complexity of types of institutions, but the talk here is about higher education in general, whether start from what you would call community college to PhD awarding institution. Now, the situation with regard to university autonomy is indeed very, very different, and this is a fascinating topic for study and for work. I have done work recently, for example, in Kazakhstan for the Kazakh government, and they have their public universities with no autonomy. Professors are told what to teach in class. The list of courses in a curriculum is given by the government. They have private universities with full autonomy. And then there's the national Nazarbayev University also with full autonomy. But the government decided that all their ambitions, to be a model country in that region, economically advanced, will not be achieved unless universities have autonomy. So they invited experts, I was one of them, allegedly, trying to advise the government of Kazakhstan how to give, really was about giving autonomy to university. I have done another study for a non-governmental organization in Armenia where the conclusion is the government doesn't want to give universities any autonomy, and that's why the system is like that. The work that we have done in Myanmar was about autonomy, which is, again, fascinating. So my interlocutor at some point was the chief of cabinet of the president of Myanmar, a former brigadier general. And he wanted to know how university autonomy works in Europe. His interest was was only in Europe, which is understandable as a matter of fact. And then they are working on legislation about that. But there are other examples. Take Singapore, for example, which is a very interesting case of performance with a very particular model of autonomy. Take Brazil, with differences between state and private universities. So it is. If you are saying that I simplify a lot here, you are right. Thank you.